Hello, my name is Philippe Girard, a professor in the history department at McNeese State University.
And I'm Sarah Miller, a student in the history department. Welcome to Your Grandma Rocks, where we explore the lives of famous women in history.
Welcome and bienvenue à nos amis francophones. Vous écoutez la radio de l'Université McNeese.
On the program today, music and history as we retrace the life of a remarkable woman.
She was a criminal, but we don't have that much information about that.
She was also a slave, and we have even less about that.
She lived in Haiti, but that was before Haiti even existed as a country.
But that's not why we're covering her life today. She was the wife of the executioner of Haiti, at a time when gruesome executions were the norm.
And a fair warning to our listeners, 18th century colonial justice could be very disturbing, so viewer discretion is advised. But it is a fascinating story nonetheless, which will allow us to explore some important themes about race, colonial rules, the judicial system, and even love. And also explore what my current research is.
All right, Dr. Girard, you're the one who came up with the topic for today's show, so tell us, how did you come across her name? I've never heard of her.
Well, Marie Goyo, that is not exactly a household name, even among specialists of Haiti. I was just going through the records of the Court of Appeals of Petit Goave, a town in French colonial Haiti, because apparently that is what I like to do with my free time, when I came across an intriguing document dated October of 1726. In this document, a man named Jacob, who was described as the executioner of the town, asked if he could marry a woman who was named, you guessed it, Marie Goyo.
So it's a love story. I love that. Everyone deserves love, even an executioner. So how did the two meet?
Well, that was not exactly a meet cute in the grocery aisle. This is not a Hollywood rom-com today. Our lady, Marie Goyo, she was in the prison where the executioner lived because, well, she was a criminal. In fact, she was slated for execution.
So her future husband was supposed to execute her?
Initially, yes, she was supposed to execute her by hanging.
So not just a love story, but a story of survival. By proposing to Marie Goyo, the executioner was saving her life?
Most definitely.
Could she say no to the proposal? The alternative was death.
Well, unfortunately, that was the alternative, yes.
So much for love.
Well, I'm not even sure if we could use the term romantic love as our framework of analysis here. Because as of 1726, which is when our story takes place, Romanticism had not even been invented in literature yet. So we should not tack on 21st century values onto the 18th century. Back then, life was tough, especially for women. So for most people, marriage was more about convenience and survival than about a union of two hearts and two souls. Especially in a colony like Haiti, where 90% of the people were enslaved on sugar plantations in horrific conditions.
And she was a slave.
Yes, the document introduced her as, quote, a negress slave of Monsieur Barson.
So that limited her options even more. Either she said yes and married the executioner, or she said no and he would hang her. That's the weirdest marriage proposal in history.
Well, the story does not end there. It will get weirder. So you see, this was the second time that year that the executioner, Jacob, had proposed to someone. Earlier in 1726, he had offered to marry another enslaved black woman who had also been sentenced to be hanged. Except that this story had not ended well. To get married, the executioner needed the approval of the appeals court, but the court refused to grant his request to marry the first woman.
So what happened to her?
Well, the initial court decision stood then, so she must have been executed per the sentence.
Jacob had to kill her?
Well, presumably, yes, he was the executioner.
So he wanted to marry the first woman. The court said no, and then he had to hang her. And then he met another criminal in prison and asked her to marry him. That story keeps getting more and more depressing. Did the court at least say yes the second time?
Well, thankfully it did. The second time, the executioner promised that he would lead a more moral Christian life, and if only he could settle down with a woman, a wife. And that argument about morality convinced the judges, apparently. And now it was up to Marie Goyo to accept the proposal or not.
And it's not really a free choice either.
Well, we're dealing with a woman who was a slave in prison on death row. So she lived in a world where consent and personal freedom were not a given, that's for sure. Unfortunately, I don't have the records for her answer, but I figured that if the executioner went to the trouble of asking the court for a reprieve, he checked with his potential fiancée first, if she was interested in marrying him in the first place. We're dealing with a very fragmentary record, but I'll go out on a limb and argue that the two of them did get married in the end.
So that one case that you found in the archives, is it completely unusual? Was Marie Goyo the only executioner's wife in Haiti?
Actually, no. I found two other similar cases in my research. 10 years later, the next executioner in the same town of Petit Goave also petitioned the court to marry a convict named Marie Leloup. And I found a third case in another town of colonial Haiti that involved a woman named Catherine. And I found a note by a lawyer indicated that executioners typically found their wife in this manner by proposing to one of the convicts. So Marie Goyo, the topic for today, she was just one of many.
So from the executioner's perspective, why did they always marry a convict? Their job was pretty unusual, but it was still a job. They were professionals. They couldn't do better than a criminal and a slave?
Well, that's where we need to switch gears and talk about the social status of the executioner himself, which was not particularly high either.
Is there a lot of information about the executioners in the archives?
In Haiti, not so much. That's a topic I'm currently researching, and I'm mostly dealing with breadcrumbs here and there. But 18th century Haiti was a French colony, so let's start by exploring the world of the executioner in France, because there is much more information about that.
Off to France, allons enfants de Marseille. When did the profession begin?
Well, the death penalty has a long history, obviously, going back to antiquity at least. But in early medieval France, the death penalty was often more about vengeance, personal revenge, than execution. So the aggrieved parties occasionally carried out the death penalty themselves, or even all the villagers of the town were expected to help kill the criminals in the town.
Didn't you recently do a show about a noble who killed a rapist who had attacked his wife?
Yes, I did that with your classmate, Kelly Johnston. It was a case involving a rape victim named Marguerite de Thibouville. Watch the movie The Last Duel by Ridley Scott if you're interested in that case. Or even better, listen to the show that we taped for KBYS. But anyway, over time, it became less and less common to ask random civilians to carry out death sentences on their own. The nation-state became stronger and tried to monopolize violence. That meant a central army controlled by the king and a centralized judicial system also controlled by the king.
Which meant that a professional appointed by the king would do the killing.
Right, and that's how the executioner became a specialized job.
Who took on the job anyway? It doesn't seem like the kind of job you'd pick after reading a help wanted sign in the paper.
Well, there were very few volunteers. It was a gruesome job after all. In practice, it became a family tradition, the kind of job that was passed on from father to son. So this way the son learned the trade from the father because it required some skill. And the son did not have many other job options anyway because the families of executioners were essentially cast out from society.
Because they were the kind of people who might execute you one day? That makes sense.
Well, it was even worse than that because being an executioner was almost like a mystical profession. He stood on a scaffold halfway between earth and heaven and he meted out divine justice. It's like he stood at the entrance to the gates of hell. There was something weird about him because he dealt with death and people treated him like a pariah. The executioner and his family, they had to live in a house outside the city gates. They couldn't sit on the same pew in the church or even touch everybody else's food at the market.
That reminds me of the untouchables in India in the Hindu caste system.
Yes, France was Catholic, not Hindu, but yeah, they were definitely cast aside from society.
So back to Haiti. I assume that if the French executioners were viewed poorly, it was the same in the colonies?
It was worse, actually, because the executioner was not just the executioner in Haiti. He was also a black man, and a slave, and a criminal himself, so he suffered from a triple mark of infamy.
So Jacob, the executioner from earlier, he was also a slave? Just like Marie Goyo, the woman he proposed to?
Yes, most likely. I was not able to find the actual document that appointed him as executioner, but hiring black convicts as executioners was the norm in Haiti. And in a racially stratified society like Haiti, black executioners were the object of scorn. I found documents related to the appointment of another executioner, not Jacob, and the court literally threw his commission on the floor when they appointed him to remind him that he was dirt. And the executioner had to pick up his papers from the floor.
Wow, so he must have had to do something really bad in the first place, right? How did the court decide? This man did a crime and he'll be the executioner, and this man also did a crime, he'll be the one that's killed?
Well, there was a method to the madness. The 18th century French judicial system may seem barbaric and medieval to us, especially in the colonies, but it was carefully thought out nonetheless. To be an executioner, you had to be a man who was sentenced to death, but for a crime that wasn't too bad. So in practice, executioners were either a maroon, which means a runaway slave, because running away from the plantation 3 times carried the death penalty, or those executioners were a thief. Again, theft was punishable by the death penalty as long as no violence was involved.
Running away from a plantation doesn't seem like a crime to me. Planters were essentially kidnappers, right? They took Africans from their homeland and forced them to work for life without pay. A person who runs away from a plantation and maybe steals some food to survive, that's not a criminal. That's a freedom fighter.
That is a very good point. I'm working with the documents that I have, and typically these are documents issued by the court system or by the planners. They were all part of a judicial system that was fundamentally unfair. So it's always good to keep this in mind whenever I use terms like slave and criminal and illegal. That is according to the colonial authorities.
I'm glad we cleared that up. So was there any quote-unquote crime that was so bad that they couldn't be an executioner?
Oh yes, this was clearly spelled out. Running away, theft, these were crimes that were important enough to warrant the death penalty, but benign enough that authorities were willing to commute the sentence into something else, being an executioner for life. But any crime involving violence against a white man or white woman, that was unforgivable. Hurting or killing your master, that was the big taboo in a slave society. That was punishable by death without possibility of reprieve.
So they picked non-violent criminals to commit violence.
Yeah, that is strange. In a way, you had to have committed no violence before so that you would be allowed to commit violence as an executioner.
I understand a bit better now why our executioner Jacob wanted to marry Marie Goyo. She was a black slave who was sentenced to death for some crime. He was also a black convict. Their social status was pretty much the same.
Yes, both were at the bottom of social hierarchy, despised by all. And by the way, their death sentence was not cancelled, it was just suspended. So if Jacob ever refused to go on as executioner, he would be killed per the original sentence. Same thing if Marie Goyo no longer wanted to be his wife.
That's messed up.
Well, Kafkaesque, if you want to use a fancy word. That would be a good way to describe it.
Okay, so I have a question. You said that the runaways and thieves incurred the death penalty. So did murderers. What's the point of running away and stealing food then? Slaves might as well kill their master while they're at it if the penalty is the same.
Well, in the 18th century, there was death, and then there was death. Petty criminals were killed in a fairly humane way by hanging. Murderers, that's another story.
I guess this is where we get into the gory details and need to remind our listeners one more time that this material may not be suitable for kids.
18th century executions were a pretty horrid business, yes. I have read dozens of accounts, but it doesn't get easier. After a day of research, sometimes I need a good shower and a very dry martini.
Okay, I'm afraid to ask. What are we talking about?
Well, as I mentioned, there was death by hanging. That's for running away repeatedly as a slave or for theft. And there were lesser penalties for even lesser crimes, too. So flogging was common, as you can imagine, in a slave society. And then there was branding and cutting off body parts like noses and ears, and hard labor for life, and deportation.
Deportation, hard labor for life, branding, flogging, isn't that what slaves had to deal with in their daily lives?
Anyway, yes, and that's why the judicial system had to go into overdrive when there was an actual crime committed, because you had to go very, very far to actually make an impression on slaves who lived a terrible life anyway.
I'm afraid to ask, what could be worse than flogging and branding someone and then hanging them?
Well, there is torture, which was done legally in 18th century France against both suspects during the prosecution phase and then again publicly as part of the execution itself. And then also drawing and quartering with like cohosts and such for crimes of rebellion against the state. Poisoners, they were burnt alive. And people who hit or killed their master, who committed aggravated theft, they were sentenced to execution on the wheel. And that was the most common death penalty that I have seen in the colonial archives.
And what is that?
Well, it was pretty gruesome. People were tied to a cross horizontally, and then the executioner would just break up all the bones in their arms and legs with an iron bar one by one. And then what remained of the body would be tied up to a wheel, still alive, and the condemned would be left to die in agony for hours.
That's medieval. We're always taught 18th century Europe as the Enlightenment, John Locke, Mozart.
Well, there were a number of 18th century philosophers who complained that these horrible punishments, which, by the way, were also carried out in Europe against white criminals, were medieval and senseless and had to be abandoned. Though again, there was a method to the madness. All these penalties were carefully sought out and spelled out in the sentence. The prisoner would be taken out from the prison, through the town in a carriage, bearing a sign that specified what crime they had committed, and then he would stop in front of the church to make amends to God, and then they would be subjected to some of the lesser parts of the sentence, such as cutting off the fist of a slave who would hit their master, and then you'd have the actual execution. And then the body would often be exposed in a public place, like a crossroads, or burnt so that there would be no trace of the crime.
Publicly? So they just did this in front of everyone?
Well, not only could people see that, but they were expected to. That's the whole point of the procedure. The goal was to instill terror, to scare away potential criminals, especially slaves. An execution was a show meant to educate the public on the perils of endangering public peace. So they were done in the market square on market days so that you would maximize attendance. And there were people who actively sought out executions because it was a form of entertainment.
So they liked it?
Well, some people did, yes. They even brought their kids to executions. But even if the people did not like what they would see, well, sometimes they had to watch anyways. Some of the executions were carried out in the plantation where the condemned slave came from to make sure that his friend and his family would have to witness the death in person.
So you mentioned in passing that penalties in Europe were pretty similar. So these horrible executions, they're not necessarily tied to slavery per se then?
Well, up to a point. I haven't gone far enough in my research to do statistical comparisons, but I do get the sense that in the colonies, penalties were harsher for similar crimes, and that those crimes were more common than in France, which would make sense because in Haiti, slaves represented 90% of the population, so authorities were very concerned about revolt. Terror was a big part of the system. But there were some white criminals in Haiti who were sentenced to the wheel.
So if the executioner was a black convict and white criminals could theoretically be sentenced to a horrible death too, does that mean the black executioner occasionally killed a white criminal? Or did they have two executioners, one white and one black?
Well, as far as I can tell, there was only one executioner who was black and who killed everyone.
Even though black on white violence was the single biggest taboo in a slave colony.
That was the most surprising aspect of my research. But remember that technically the executioner did not personally kill the condemned. He was acting on behalf of the king, so he was just a tool. And also remember that executioners were specifically selected among petty criminals who had not injured whites before him.
But that's still weird, even in a slave society.
Yeah, I'm still wrapping my head around it. One important caveat, rich white planters were never executed like this. The court system often gave them a free pass even for terrible crimes or simply deported them to France. The kind of people you see being broken in the wheel or hanged by a black executioner are the so-called petits blancs, the little whites of the colony, the wage laborers, the sailors, the soldiers, white trash, if you will.
But still, in such a socially stratified society, the fact that some white people were executed by black men.
Yeah, that can be surprising, yes. But early in the 18th century, the case we talked about is 1726. At that point, racial categories are not hardened yet. The concept of race was still in the making. So to many people, poor whites were not that different from poor blacks. But then, as the century progressed, racism as an idea became more clear-cut in the public mind, and even poor whites began to see themselves as members of the superior race.
So how did they deal with that in this new context? It still doesn't make any sense.
Well, to a lot of people, it did not. And I've seen some indication that execution of white people by black people became less acceptable in the second half of the 18th century when racism became more commonplace. I saw two accounts of executions of white criminals in the city of Cap Français in 1777 and 78. And in both cases, the white crowd rioted when the black executioner tried to kill the white convict, and then they attacked the executioner, and one of those executioners even died in the process.
So at the end of the day, the criminal was alive and the executioner was dead.
That's ironic, right? Until you remember that the executioner was just some poor bloke who was forced to take on the job, so he was in a way a victim too. But to me, those two lynches are a sign that the white population was increasingly attached to stricter racial boundaries, so executions of white criminals, even lower-class ones, became unacceptable to the white public by the end of the century. And in the years that followed, I noticed that the executioner was kept locked up in the prison at all times, not just because he was a criminal himself, but for his own safety. And I also noticed that executions of white criminals started to become rarer. The last ones I found involved American and Spanish sailors, i.e. foreign citizens who had few local allies who could riot on their behalf.
Well, that was quite a deep and honestly depressing dive into the world of public executions. But it's time to cycle back to Our Lady of the Hour, Marie Goyo. This show's supposed to be about her. Did you find any other documents about her, except for the marriage proposal of sorts?
Well, documents about slaves are notoriously few, especially about female slaves, but I got lucky.
How'd you get lucky?
Well, remember how the document mentioned that the executioner, Jacob, first wanted to marry another woman who also had been sentenced to death, and then he asked to marry Marie Goyo secondly.
Right.
Well, both women were sentenced on May 6 of 1726, according to that document. So I flipped back 6 months through the documents and found the court decree that had sentenced both of them to death in the first place. And I found the name of Marie Goyo on it. That was the great find.
So both of these women were sentenced at the same time? Was it for the same crime?
Yes. They were actually part of a big court case that involved 30 slaves in all. I'll tell you more about it, but after our musical break. Our first song is from across the Atlantic, from Haiti. It is by a band from the Congo called TPOK Jazz, and it's about a man who is a bourreau de cœur, which roughly translates as serial seductor.
Ouvre-moi la porte vraiment, je suis au comble du désespoir. Oyininga boyena kamwe minge. Songiselanga tendresse na pesa yo mama. Bato mabe bako profite mo baseka biso tika boye mwana yo nakoni kaka mokolo moko. Le plus proche de l'amour, c'est la haine. Moto ya lingaka makasi, yende aboyaka makasi. Tozalaki pourtant lokola bana mapasa. Bapasi na bisengo nyonso tokabolaki. Na comprendre yo lelo tina oboyinga. Obayenga po mobulu elekanga. Baby, soto pona yo di loulouré. Ouvre-moi la porte vraiment, je suis au comble du désespoir. Oyininga boyena kamwe minge. Songiselanga tendresse na pesa yo mama. Bato mabe bako profite po baseka biso tika boye mwana yo.
Bonjour and welcome back to Your Grammar Rocks. We just listened to Bourreau de Cœur. Je m'appelle Philippe Girard.
I'm Sarah Miller. Today we're exploring the life of Marie Goyo, a black convict in 18th century Haiti who became the wife of an executioner in 1726. Before our break, you mentioned that you were able to find a document that sentenced her to death.
Yes, and it's a big one. The case involves 30 slaves in southwest Haiti who were part of a big band of Maroons, runaway slaves. And when those Maroons were on the lam, they attacked and stole from different people in the countryside, including white passers-by, and they also killed 2 white bar owners during a robbery.
So very serious crimes by colonial standards. They actually killed white people.
Yes, and even worse, by creating a band of Maroons that threatened the social order in general or even the very institution of slavery. So justice was harsh.
This is a very scary episode. I'm terrified. What was the punishment?
Well, I really can't go through every punishment because it is really gruesome. But remember that penalty of breaking a person's limbs and then letting them die?
The wheel?
Well, Jacques, one of the defendants, he was punished that way. And then the same thing happened after that to another defendant named Jean.
That's disgusting. What about Marie? You said her name was on the list?
Well, women never endured the wheel for some reason, so she was supposed to die by hanging instead. And that was the same thing with 3 other women that day who were also sentenced to death. I mentioned that the executioner, Jacob, he first tried to marry another woman, so I suppose that one of these 3 women who was hanged was the one that he had wanted to marry in the first place. Except, remember, that the court refused, and tragically, he had to hang her anyway.
Wait, so if the second woman he proposed to, Marie Goyo, was also supposed to be killed in May of 1726, why is she still alive in October 1726 when he offered to marry her?
Well, there is a discrepancy in the records, yes. My guess is that Marie got pregnant. One of the big rules of 18th century justice was that pregnant women could not be executed because then, well, that would endanger the life of the baby in their womb. So I'm pretty sure that Marie Goyo was not killed that May alongside the others because she was pregnant.
Which would explain why 6 months later the executioner asked to marry her. By that point, she'd had her baby, and there was a risk that she'd be executed after all. We're back to the love story after all. Maybe he simply wanted to save her life. Maybe he was the dad.
I like the sound of that. Survival against all odds and a bit of love in there. But still, even when they were spared, criminals were typically expected to watch the execution of their accomplices, so there's a strong chance that poor Marie Goyo had to watch her future husband as he broke apart the bodies of Jacques and Jean and then hanged 3 other women. All these were the people who had lived as runaways with Marie Goyo. These were her friends. That must have been very, very tough to watch.
I can't imagine. You mentioned the execution involved 30 people. What about the others?
Well, 13 of them were kept in prison pending further investigation because their case was not closed yet. Some others were sentenced to quote-unquote slightly less penalties like branding and whipping. But then we were up to the 5 male leaders of the band who had actually killed white people, and for them, the sentence was the worst.
What could possibly be worse than the wheel?
Well, people had a lot of imagination back then, so without going into too many gory details, they were subjected to a variety of public tortures. I'll spare you the details. And then they were drawn and quartered by 4 horses, which tells me that the authorities were really scared of that maroon group because being quartered by horses, that was normally the penalty for big conspiracies that endangered the state, not just random theft.
Like Tupac Amaru II.
Exactly. You did a show about him.
Yes. So you're telling me that Jacob, the executioner, did all of this in a single day. Obviously, the main victims were the people sentenced to death, but I can't imagine the physical and emotional toll on the executioner as well.
It was a tough job, yes. In fact, I found several cases of other executioners who said, I can't do this anymore. Simply hang me as planned because I would rather die than live like this and do that kind of stuff. And I also found some other executioners who simply fled from the prison and just disappeared from the records.
Finally, some good news. Some people resisted the system.
Well, another piece of good news. Do you remember those 5 main maroon leaders who were supposed to be tortured to death and quartered and so forth? Well, the court decision that I read specified that all these tortures would be inflicted, quote, in effigy on a painting tied to the scaffold.
In effigy? On a painting? What's that supposed to mean?
Well, that meant that the leaders of the maroon group were still at large, so the court could not actually physically kill them. But by golly, the court was still going to make an example of them to the public, so they would be killed, but in effigy.
That's bizarre.
Well, we're just scratching the surface here, because not only were some criminals executed in effigy in Haiti, that was pretty common, but sometimes executioners would also execute animals, like a pig or a dog who had killed a child. They would be put on trial and executed. And executioners even killed inanimate objects. I saw cases in Haiti where the executioner was supposed to destroy a book on the scaffold in the case of a libel, and even a chastity belt. Apparently, selling chastity belts was forbidden in colonial Haiti, so the executioner had to bring them to the scaffold, get his iron bar, and execute the chastity belt.
That's crazy. They must have been eating lead paint. At least these executions didn't involve human beings, and I'm glad to hear that 5 of the runaways managed to stay alive. What about Jacob and Marie Goyo? Did you find any other documents about the rest of their lives?
Well, unfortunately, no. There is the execution scene in May 1726, which tells me that Marie Goyo was initially part of a band of runaways. Then there's that petition to the court in October that year, which indicates that she was still alive at that point, and the executioner, Jacob, wanted to marry her at that point, probably because they had a child together. And based on those 2 documents, I'm pretty sure that they got married and had a child together. I did find a 3rd document that allows me to extrapolate on the rest of their lives, even though it's not technically about them. It's a document from 10 years later, and it's about another executioner in the same town of Petit Goave.
But that meant that Jacob died, right, if he was replaced?
Well, that would be my guess. Either that, or positively, maybe he quit somehow, or he ran away. Fun fact, the new executioner mentioned that he also needed a wife because he had, quote, a bad hernia.
A hernia? What's that got to do with anything?
Well, that took me a long time to figure it out. Then I remembered that in France, the family of the executioner, including his wife, often helped him out during executions because, cutting apart people, that's a tough physical job. So I figured that the new executioner, he wanted a wife because he had a bad hernia and he needed her to help with future executions, which tells me that the woman, including the one we studied today, Marie Goyo, may also have assisted her own husband, Jacob, so she was not just the executioner's wife, but very likely the executioner's assistant.
That's a big, horrible twist. Today's story is not fun.
But I'd like to think that Jacob and Marie disappear from the records because they ran away, okay? And after all, she was a veteran Maroon herself, so that makes the whole story a tiny bit more bearable. That he saved her life by marrying her, they had a child together, and they both ran to freedom. Again, I don't have the documentation for the last part, but I sure hope that in the end, love and freedom triumphed after all.
I like that better than the grim picture you painted today.
There is another positive aspect, because remember that in 1791, the slaves of Haiti revolted, you know why, and amazingly won. and that was the only successful slave revolt in history. That same year, the new French Penal Code abolished cruel and unusual punishments in France. That's another positive. And between the reforms of the French Revolution and the slave revolt in Haiti and the abolition of slavery, well, the era of gruesome public executions in French colonies came to an end.
I don't know how you did it, but you found a way to end on a positive note. Marie and Jacob may have found love after all, and in the end, liberty prevailed. It's like coming out of a long nightmare. How are you going to work on this topic, Dr. Gerard?
Well, I won't work on that forever. That definitely takes a toll, but I'm almost done with the primary research in the archives. Then I'll present my findings at professional conferences or on the radio in that show. And then I'll get to the real stuff of writing a couple in-depth articles in professional journals. And then, end of story, I'll move on to my next topic, which I think will be about the history of puppies or rainbows or unicorns or something of that nature. I really need a break.
Well, it was still a fascinating story. I'm glad you could share it with us. This program was funded by a Juliet Hartner Grant for Women in the Humanities.
This program was also sponsored by the History Department of McNeese.